Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalamu ala sayyidil anbiya wal mursaleen. This is Mujeeb Kazi, and you're watching Washington Roundtable from the studio of DC. And I'm very humble and honored and thrilled to have a very special guest with us who has joined us from the Wilson Center. He is the senior fellow and the deputy director for the South Asia policy, Michael Kugelman. Michael, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Good to be here with you.
Absolutely. Pleasure is all mine. Let me start off by this troubled region, South Asia, particularly in the last 40 years that we have seen turmoils, 20 years of long, 2 decades long war against Afghanistan. And my focus would be on Kashmir today. And then obviously we will dive into the entire region. At one point, when Prime Minister of Pakistan visited Washington, we noticed that Washington was very eager to solve this long outstanding Kashmir conflict. And President Trump at that time offered a mediation to both countries, India and Pakistan. Does the Biden administration stands by it, or the policy has changed?
Yeah. So first of all, thanks for having me in this conversation. I've been looking forward to it. So, to your question, certainly I think that when India revoked Article 370 of the Constitution in 2019, the consequences of that, particularly in terms of the detentions and the internet bans and all of the rights violations that happened after that, it was something that concerned the Trump administration for sure. And as you had the tensions rise between India and Pakistan, after that happened, indeed, President Trump did suggest a willingness to mediate the dispute. But, my sense is that he wasn't really offering formally to mediate because, he phrased his offer in some very striking language. He said, I would be happy to mediate, or I'd be happy to help out with this dispute if both sides want me to. And the last part of that comment, in my view, essentially took away a lot of the potential power from the first part of the statement. When he said that if both sides agree, basically that was giving India an out. I mean, he was basically saying that if Pakistan and India are keen for US mediation, that he would be all for it. But we all know that India has always been opposed to external mediation in the Kashmir dispute. So I think that for President Trump, he was able to say something that would essentially appease both sides. He sort of made an offer, which was, I think, for Pakistan, many were receptive to that. But at the same time, he caveated it by saying if both sides agree, which basically was a message to India that, this wasn't a real serious offer. So I think that looking to the Biden administration, the policy really hasn't changed. I think that the U.S. policy in Kashmir has really been quite consistent for quite some time, and that is that it is really an issue. It's a bilateral issue to be addressed by India and by Pakistan, and of course, this is really reflecting the Indian position on the dispute. So, I think that with the Biden administration, certainly because of its professed interest in making democracy and rights promotion a pillar of its foreign policy, that suggests to me that this administration may be attuned to human rights concerns in the region, in Kashmir, and particularly when it comes to internet bans, which have always been a major concern for President Biden. And the administration has offered some rather soft but nonetheless public criticism of India's practice of banning the internet. So I think that's what we could look for. But in terms of any type of policy shift on Kashmir coming from the Biden administration, I really would not expect that.
There is a public perception and that there is a reality, and there is a negotiation between the states. You had mentioned that it's a bilateral issue. Where the people of Kashmir come into play in this, because they have never been part of the negotiation between whether it's been an international forum or an offer by the US or at UN. Where do the Kashmiris, the indigenous Kashmiris, do fit in this equation?
Yeah, it's an absolutely essential point, which I certainly would have brought up if you did not, but I'm glad you did. I think that so many discussions on Kashmir are essentially hijacked, or maybe that's too strong a term, dominated by Indian and Pakistani perspectives, or perspectives from elsewhere outside of Kashmir, whereas the voices of Kashmiris themselves are often eclipsed. And I know that in part that's not the fault of Kashmiris, because in many cases Kashmiris are not in a position to project their voices, because it's difficult for them to communicate with the outside world when you have these communication limitations, internet bans, and so on and so forth. And obviously it's very risky for people in Kashmir to try to offer viewpoints on what's going on. As you know, there's really very little independent media in Kashmir at this point. There are a few really impressive outlets, most of them web outlets in Kashmir, but there aren't all that many of them. So I think this makes the diaspora, the Kashmiri diaspora, incredibly important. And I know, of course, there's a large diaspora of Kashmiris in the West, particularly in the US and the UK and elsewhere. So I think that they have really begun to try to champion the plight or the position of Kashmiris when Kashmiris themselves in Kashmir are unable to do so. And I think that, if you look at the Kashmiris in the valley, 6-7 million Kashmiri Muslims there, I think their view is quite unanimous, or close to it, that they really have no interest in living under Indian rule, so to speak. And clearly the Article 370 revocation was not at all popular, to put it mildly, among Kashmiri Muslims. Now you have other communities in Kashmir that certainly would think differently. And certainly those Kashmiri Pandits who have been very vocal about how they think very differently, and may well support the government, for the Indian government, for what it did with the Article 370 revocation. But for the majority of Kashmiris, I think that their view is that anything is better than what's going on now, so to speak. And it's controversial to get into discussions about public sentiment and what Kashmiris want, if they want to become a part of Pakistan, if they want things to stay the same, if they want to become free. But clearly the Azadi calls are very strong, so to speak, and you hear this a lot, particularly from those outside of Kashmir, among the diaspora that are trying to take up their cause. So I think that if there's one thing that could be said here, it's that the status quo is not acceptable in Kashmir for most of these people that live under very difficult circumstances in the Kashmir Valley.
You have pointed out some of the core issues of human rights violation in the region, particularly in the Indian occupied regions. And the most of the concerns, the major concerns, are the demographic changes with the cultures and political and economic and rights of associations and freedom that has been squeezed, and it being squeezed almost every day. The whole people annihilated, So and this is the question that came from the public. Then I want to put it out there, maybe a little harsh, but I want you to address it. Is the U.S. waiting for the genocide to take place in Indian occupied Kashmir? You have 1 million boots, over 8 million people are in open caged. What is it the U.S. is waiting for? Because the people in the region have built up lots of hopes for U.S., particularly after that statement, even though it was not a serious statement, but people who were losing hope in the region took it very seriously that the President Trump at that time was indeed serious to resolve this issue.
Yeah, and this is unfortunate, because, as I said before, I really don't think Trump was serious about wanting to solve the dispute, even though he was very concerned about it, for sure. Well, look, it's a very difficult question. I think here in Washington, and sort of trying to articulate the views of official Washington, I think there's a sense that as troubling as the situation is, you don't have anything approximating an imminent genocide. That certainly there's an acknowledgement of how troubled the situation is, and there's a recognition of the fact that the consequences of the Article 370 revocation will indeed facilitate laws and policies that could lead to demographic shifts in the region, and so on and so forth. There's an acknowledgement of that. But it's just for a variety of reasons, which we could go into. The U.S., not just the current administration, but most previous administrations have not wanted to touch the Kashmir issue with a 10-foot pole. They just see it as much too complex and much too messy for the U.S. to get involved in. And I think that as the U.S. relationship with India has grown in recent years, I think that position has only become solidified because of the realization that that's a position that would be acceptable to India, so to speak. And there's a desire here not to risk antagonizing India by trying to inject itself into the Kashmir dispute, which of course India has no interest in having anyone on the outside trying to get involved or intervene in. So, as I had said, I think that the human rights situation in Kashmir is something that Americans within government, and certainly on Capitol Hill, particularly on the Democratic side, this is something that they have brought attention to and they'll continue to bring attention to. And here, I would argue that members of Congress are impelled by their constituencies, so their constituents, their voters. And so I think that here is a place where the Kashmiri diaspora can be very important by trying to advocate to their members of Congress, to their elected officials, that you really need to bring more attention to this, try to focus on it more, try to get the administration to focus on it more, because if not, X, Y, and Z can happen, and this would not be good for U.S. interests. So I think that that's I imagine the best way that I could answer your question. But bottom line is, I think the view here in Washington is that it would be an exaggeration to suggest that there's an imminent genocide coming, and that the human rights situation and the broader state of play in Kashmir is very troubling. But the administration is the current administration and previous ones much prefer to keep a relatively low profile and just try to encourage India and Pakistan to work things out themselves, and by implication, this is never directly stated, for India to try to work with stakeholders in Kashmir to have some type of dialogue to work something out. One could argue that the U.S., by taking this hands-off role on Kashmir, sort of incurs risks, because certainly what we have seen over time is that when India and Pakistan have gone to war over Kashmir, or when they're at risk of going to war over Kashmir, that's when the U.S. jumps in to try to get the two sides to walk back from the precipice and ease tensions. But one could argue perhaps that if the U.S. were to preemptively try to focus more on the Kashmir issue, try to get the two, India and Pakistan, to work on it more, then that would reduce the chances of Kashmir becoming the motivation for another war between the two countries. And I'm not saying there's going to be another war between the two countries anytime soon, but I think that that's a position that the U.S. has decided to take, to be reactive as opposed to proactive when it comes to the Kashmir dispute and the tensions that it produces between India and Pakistan. But this is the position that the administration has taken.
You have mentioned a very important point about the escalation of war. For every confrontation between India and Pakistan brings the potential of escalation to the nuclear and the nuclear war, and it has been and it will always be based on the Kashmir being the flashpoint of the war between the two. So, are you suggesting that this Kashmir conflict will never trigger war between the two countries? Because there is because people in Kashmir and for some reason in the public sentiment in Pakistan is that if there is ever going to be a war between India and Pakistan, that would be over Kashmir. And you are suggesting that would not happen? I'm kind of puzzled there.
No, I'm not saying it wouldn't happen. I say that I don't want to overstate the possibility that there will be a next war over Kashmir anytime soon. But certainly, given what happened in 2019 with the Balakot crisis, that was sparked by an attack on Indian forces in Kashmir. And I think what we saw in that crisis, which I wouldn't describe as a war, I mean, it was a crisis that could have escalated into a conflict. We saw clear cases of the two sides being willing to use conventional force under the nuclear umbrella, right? I mean, we know that India decided to retaliate for the attack on its forces by, launching those strikes in Balakot. It's unclear what exactly happened from those strikes. It was the first time in many years that you had Indian military force coming across into Pakistan proper. And clearly, what the biggest lesson from that crisis, which again came out of something that happened in Kashmir, is that both sides are willing to use force under the nuclear umbrella, but the more each side is willing to use force under the nuclear umbrella, the more likely the risk of escalation to nuclear levels. So that suggests to me that when there is a next crisis between India and Pakistan over Kashmir, it could more easily graduate to a nuclear exchange, just because both sides would be confident that they could come in sort of higher up on the escalation ladder to start with, where they could do things through conventional forces that would bring them closer to a nuclear exchange. And I don't want to overstate the possibility, but it's something that we certainly can't rule out. And obviously, the better the relationship is on the whole between the two, the less chances there is of a conflict. There was a border ceasefire signed earlier this year, but despite that, the relationship is still very tense for sure.
So, speaking of possibility, obviously, I think there's a consensus around the globe by the Senate that right now the current regime of India that has taken over the government are kind of extremist. Just lack of better words, they have subdued the rights of the minorities. We have seen the protest by the farmers that has been going on for many days, and still minorities are not being given the rights what they deserve. And anything can be possible in terms of escalation of war. I'm going to switch over to what happened with the withdrawal of the forces from Afghanistan by U.S. 2 decades of war and over $2 trillion of financial loss, and close to 500,000 human loss, and then leaving the region without a settlement. A political settlement. Do you think that will bring any impact on Kashmir issue?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't necessarily see any clear implications for the Kashmir issue, just because certainly the withdrawal will mean that the Taliban will get even stronger than it already is, but the Taliban is very parochial in the sense that it is very focused on Afghanistan-focused issues. It's waging this insurgency. It wants to hold power, and it wants to reestablish this Islamic Emirate. And even though it has relationships with violent actors that are more global in focus, like Al Qaeda, and even though it has relationships with other countries, like Pakistan particularly, but it also has a long-standing relationship with Iran. Despite that, it is a very Afghanistan-focused group. I mean, it's never been involved in any type of activity, and never been involved in any type of military activities outside of Afghanistan. Its leaders have a presence in Pakistan. They also, to a lesser extent, have a presence in Iran. But I really don't think that the Kashmir issue is something that galvanizes the Afghan Taliban. Now, certainly, I wouldn't be surprised if there been a few statements every now and then issued by the Taliban expressing solidarity with Kashmiris, but this is not really something that the Afghan Taliban does. It really is not all that interested in trying to express solidarity with Muslims around the world or even within the region. It really is not into this game of championing the causes of oppressed Muslims. So that to me suggests the Taliban is not going to go out of its way to try to link itself up with what's happening in Kashmir. So that's enough. Who knows what could happen further down the road? But looking at this in the immediate term, the U.S. NATO forces will leave Afghanistan. The Taliban will be in a position to ramp up its offensive or to try to force the Afghan government into negotiations under pressure because of what the Taliban has been doing to Afghan forces in the battlefield. The Taliban would hope to get power in Afghanistan, but I think that is really its goal. I don't think that it's looking beyond into the world more broadly to try to link its goals in Afghanistan to what's happening outside.
So, looking at the current, the situation is developing every day in Afghanistan, but we are just going to dedicate next few minutes on Pakistan, what's happening there. How do you see the Prime Minister of Pakistan taking up the Kashmir issue on a global stage? He has clearly mentioned that the status quo is not an option. It's not doable. And in his various public statements, that he has mentioned that let the people of Kashmir decide what do they want their future to look like, which means that people are, if they were to choose to be an independent country, so be it. Uh, on the other hand, we see that in Kashmir being, and according to you, being the bilateral issue between India and Pakistan, both countries are not talking. Obviously, we're not talking about the backdoor channel diplomacy that is going on, but on the issue, particularly in Kashmir, they're not talking, but public statements are coming. How do you see that seriousness of the Kashmir conflict being resolved between the two countries?
Well, I'm quite skeptical. I mean, certainly after the border ceasefire between India and Pakistan, some analysts have suggested that could be a big confidence-building measure, that could be a springboard to getting the two sides back at the negotiating table to discuss Kashmir. But that, I think, was always a bit of a wishful thinking, as I would put it. I don't think the Modi government is particularly interested in getting back into this at all. And in fact, that after it repealed Article 370, it basically said that the Kashmir issue is off the table, and then if Pakistan wants to have a dialogue with India about Kashmir, it would be over Pakistan-administered Kashmir, which obviously is not something that I assume is not something that Pakistan would really want to put into a dialogue. And likewise, we see that there have been statements from Pakistani officials that there can only be a dialogue with India if Jammu and Kashmir, if the case of Jammu and Kashmir is taken up, which India doesn't want to do. So I think that's a circle that would have to be squared, so to speak. And I don't see that as an option by any means. So this is why I think you've seen this upsurge in diplomatic activity, or attempted diplomatic activity by the Pakistanis to try to get Kashmir on global agendas. This is not a new policy, of course. This is something that Pakistan has done for decades, really its entire existence. But I think Imran Khan brings a more, maybe a more charismatic approach to it. And he sort of has a celebrity status in much of the world. So he's, people know who he is. So the idea is that maybe people would pay more attention to what he's saying. But honestly, I don't think that his outreach has had much of an impact. I think that Pakistan has been able to count on its usual friends, China, as well as Turkey, and a few other Muslim majority countries, but not many. I think it's quite striking that even the OIC countries, much of the Muslim world, has been very quiet on the Kashmir issue, has not been willing to be as vocal as Pakistan would like them to be. And I think that's a function of the fact that they see India as an important market, as an important trade partner, and they don't want to antagonize it. So, this leaves Pakistan with the predicament, right? I mean, if its campaign to drum up support through diplomatic channels is not working, if efforts at dialogue with India are not working, what options does that leave Pakistan? And I think this is a question that hasn't really been sufficiently answered yet.
So from Kashmiri point of view, and based on your research and your interaction with the diaspora, if I were to ask you that if you were in a Kashmiri's shoes, what would you see? What would be the solution for the Kashmir? How do they see their future?
Well, that's a tough question. I think from a sort of like a geopolitical perspective, the best outcome is essentially to formalize the status quo, essentially to accept the line of control as a border, essentially, to state that, Azad Jammu and Kashmir will be Pakistan's Kashmir and Jammu and Kashmir will be India's Kashmir. But I understand and recognize that neither side would accept that, for sure. And I think that, at least for the Kashmiris that I speak to, the Kashmiris that I know, it seems quite clear that their desire is for freedom, is for separation or independence, so to speak. But I think also a recognition that that's very unlikely, that that's not something that's going to happen anytime soon. So I think that unfortunately the Kashmiris are stuck in the spot that they've been in for quite some time, Because I think unless there's some type of dialogue process internally in Kashmir with channels to engagement with the central government in New Delhi, I don't really see how anything is going to change anytime soon, given that the international community is not going to be pushing this very heavily. I mean, certainly, there's been a lot of journalists and activists, human rights activists, and others, certainly in the US and beyond, that are really doing a good job of centralizing this issue, making it a big issue in their advocacy. But the powers that be, the governments, the UN even, which I think is the only major international institution that you could look at as an organization that's taken a serious interest in Kashmir. Even the UN has been fairly quiet, and there have been some meetings since August 2019, usually that China helps facilitate around Kashmir, but nothing really comes of that. And so I think that if the UN is not really taking a big interest in this, then I don't see what other international organization would either.
In the last 1 minute, I know you may not have a yes or no answer to this question, but I'm still going to ask you because based on your expertise in the research, what is the one main reason that keeping the Kashmir issue being resolved?
Sorry, the one issue keeping it from being resolved?
Yes. Obviously, it has very many factors, but what is the one major factor that keeping the Kashmir issue being resolved?
I guess I would highlight leadership, because you look at the past, there were some efforts, some attempts to try to develop a peace process that would have addressed the Kashmir issue once and for all. So I think that, most recently, even though it's not really recent anymore, you had the Musharraf formula where he and Manmohan Singh and India had agreed to an arrangement to essentially settle the Kashmir issue. So those were two leaders that were willing to take that step. Of course, it didn't work out, especially because Musharraf had all kinds of political unrest at home, and then he had to resign. You had the Mumbai terror attacks. It didn't work out for sure with with that plan for peace. But I think that the trick is to find the right leaders, and I certainly know that many in Pakistan would suggest that Imran Khan is the right leader to be at the forefront of this. But I think that in India, Prime Minister Modi is not that leader that would be willing to sort of step out and propose a peace plan. One could argue that since he is, a nationalist, a hardliner, that he could be that the hardliner that sort of emulates the whole Nixon goes to China example of the hardliner having the political currency to be able to take someone who's not only a nationalist but also quite popular, as Modi is in India. Even after the horrific pandemic surge, he's very popular. Maybe he could be the one that goes out on a limb and, is able to incur the political risks to try to reach across the aisle, so to speak, and propose a peace process. But I just don't see him. I don't see him doing that. So I think that what we need to see is leaders on both sides, not just one leader, but leaders on both sides, as well as leaders in Kashmir who would give the requisite buy-in for these types of negotiations, who would all be willing to push forward on some type of settlement. But I think that those leaders are not in place right now.
I'm just going to have to leave it right there. Thank you so much, Michael. It has been enlightening, and thank you so much for giving us the time. And thank you so much for speaking on the issue of Kashmir. Take good care of yourself until next time. Goodbye for now.